I'm Jacob Goldsmith, and I'm really excited to be talking about what I see as the future of relationships. I'm a clinical psychologist. So much of my work is with young adults who are in the process of identity development, finding themselves, figuring out what they want out of relationships. And so the future of relationships is pretty relevant to the work that I'm doing and to the clients who I see. And I want to draw from my clinical experience today, but obviously I can't talk about specific cases without violating confidentiality. So instead, what I've done is tried to mash some cases together, de-identify them, and come up with a clinical example that I think represents a lot of what I see. So with that in mind, I want you to meet Anna. Anna is 28 years old. She's a straight woman living in Chicago. And she's coming into therapy saying, I'm so anxious that I'm not married yet. She's seeing her friends get married. She's seeing her friends move in together. She's got an incredible amount of anxiety about that. But as we start doing our exploration in therapy, we learn a couple of things. First, we learn that she really enjoys living with her friends. She's got 3 women who she lives with. She has deep emotional connections to them. And she likes that. The next thing we get out of our work together is that she enjoys dating. She enjoys sex. She enjoys being in relationships. But she hasn't really found a way to make a long-term relationship work for her. Next, she thinks she probably wants to be a mom. This feels really important to her. However, she definitely hasn't found any one person, any one man, who she can combine these 3 things into a relationship that feels good for her. And so she's incredibly anxious. She comes into therapy asking, what's wrong with me that I can't make marriage work? And to sort of foreshadow where I'm going to go with this talk today, my hope is that in 10 or 15 years, if someone like Anna was coming into therapy, she'd be asking a very different question. It wouldn't be, what's wrong with me that I can't make relationships or marriage work? It's, what's wrong with marriage that it's not the thing that works for me? Now, before you think that what I'm trying to do is knock marriage off its pedestal, I promise you I'm not. I'm not trying to knock marriage off its pedestal at all. I'm advocating that we build more pedestals. Now, to know why I want to do that, we first have to look at the history of relationships, because in some ways relationships change radically over time, but in many ways they stay very much the same. To illustrate that, let's think about Chicago in winter. It's probably not a stretch to think about this, right? If you're in Chicago in winter, you need a coat. It can be a short coat, it can be a long coat, it can be nylon, it can be wool. If you're like me, it can be one of those big furry parkas. But it basically has to keep the cold out, and it has to keep the snow out. It has to keep you dry. If it doesn't do those things, it's a lousy jacket. You're not going to wear it. Okay? Relationships are much the same way. The styles can change, just like these 3 coats look very different. 3 different relationships can look very different, but they have to do some basic things or they're not very good relationships. What are those things that relationships need to do? Well, they need to provide a venue for emotional intimacy, sexual intimacy, a sense of togetherness, love, belonging, family, whatever we want to call that, a sense of safety, and a place for self-growth. And I'll add to that cohabitation and procreation. They're up there with question marks because relationships don't have to do those things, but often we lump those into romantic relationships. Now, nothing on this list says that one relationship needs to do all of these things, right? But historically, if you ask any culture, how is it that we're supposed to meet these needs? The answer is marriage. So marriages, like other relationships or like winter jackets, look different from time to time and place to place. So marriage as a concept covers everything from relationships that are forced, and they're not at all about love, historically, to modern egalitarian romances and everything in between. I got very different messages about what it meant to be a man in a relationship than my father did or his father did. And if you were to pull back the curtain on our relationships, they'd look very different from each other. And that's just over the last 60 or 70 years. But the core thread throughout history is that marriage was basically the one right answer that was put forward to meet relational needs. Let's focus on marriage in 20th century America, because I think we see some very interesting changes that show us where the future of relationships is headed. So Bill Pinsoff talks about the death to divorce transition. What he found was that in 1900, about half of all marriages ended by 20 years. So about the median length of a marriage was 20 years. The main reason why marriages ended was death. In 2000, lo and behold, the average length of marriages was 20 years. The main reason why they ended was divorce. That's a pretty fundamental shift in terms of what marriages feel like. Let's add to that interracial and interfaith marriages, so including who can be married, no-fault divorce, same-sex partnerships in marriage, and finally, changing gender roles. Overall, what I see in 20th century America is a move towards what I would call disaggregation. We're taking this big lump that is marriage, and we're breaking it out more into its component parts. So people are allowed to live together without being married. People can have sex without being married. People can date without it actually necessarily needing to move towards marriage. So that's disaggregation. The other thing that happens, though, is that marriage remains the gold standard. So although the face of marriage radically changes, if we go back to Anna, our clinical example, this is the world that her parents grew up in. What they learned is that marriage is the gold standard, and what they taught her was that marriage was the gold standard. That brings us to the present time. And in terms of trends here and now, one of the most important that we can talk about is same-sex marriage. And I think same-sex marriage illustrates why marriage is still such a vital and important institution in America today. Probably doesn't surprise you that as states legalized same-sex marriage, we saw a reduction in stigma among gays and lesbians living in those states. But Mark Hatzenbuehler, who's a psychologist at Columbia, studied states before and after the legalization of same-sex marriage, and he found that almost immediately after the legal changes, there were improvements in mental health and also physical health. People were going to the doctor less. This was immediately after these changes. At the same time, fewer and fewer Americans are getting married. Okay? So the Pew Research Center has some of the best statistics on this. What they've found is that something like 9% of all American adults were unmarried in 1960. We're up to about 20% now. Now, that still means that most people are getting married, right? The Pew Center has projected that something like 25% of current young adults, 18 to 30-year-olds, will never marry. That's up from 7% in 1960. That seems like a great increase, right? But still means that 75% of people are going to get married. So even as fewer and fewer Americans are getting married, and Americans are marrying later and later, marriage remains this gold standard important institution. The average age of marriage in 1960 was 20. The average age of marriage today, or I guess this is in 2014, is about 29. For those of you who are over 30, think about how different you were at 29 than you were at 20. How different it is to enter that institution at 29 than it was at 20. One of the results of this, then, is that more and more Americans are having babies before they get married. The average age of first child is now actually lower than the average age of first marriage. Psychologists from University of Virginia have coined what they call the cornerstone to capstone theory to explain what's going on. What they say is in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, people tended to see marriage as the cornerstone of adulthood. You got married right out of high school or right out of college, and you did so to become an adult. And you had a relationship that you grew and developed with. Now, people see marriage as the capstone to adulthood. They have to get everything together, and then they can cap it off with marriage. So the difference there is, with the cornerstone model, you're thinking about marriage as this process that grows with you. With the capstone marriage, there's an enormous amount of pressure to get everything right and figure out what you want before you get into marriage. So this brings us to what I call my equation for modern relationships. And this explains why folks like Anna, who I mentioned earlier, have so much anxiety. We start with this long period of transition to adulthood. Okay? It's taking folks almost 10 years now to really transition to adulthood. We add to this a great amount of diversity. Diversity can be a really good thing. We have dating apps, which I think a lot of people believe gives them access to a diverse dating pool. I think other people believe it really doesn't. It just gives the illusion of access to a diverse dating pool. We have social media, which shows us that everyone is living out these unique and creative relationships. Although, of course, social media only shows us this carefully pruned and curated image that leaves out all the hard work. And throughout all of this, we maintain this gold standard of marriage. Or if it's not marriage, it's this idea that you need to find this perfect, passionate relationship that will do everything for you. So, if you get all of this right, which is a long shot, you have the opportunity for a fantastic fit. But usually, you have that opportunity with a lot of anxiety and judgment and confusion. And that brings us to the future. The way that I think we solve that anxiety and confusion and take advantage of what we're doing right as a culture right now involves a process at the individual level and a process at the cultural level. At the individual level, we need to begin to think of ourselves as on a developmental journey to figure out what we really want. So we're going to take that long developmental transition and we're going to use it to figure out what sort of relationship is going to work for us. And then at the same time as a culture, we're going to recognize what I think is obviously right in front of us today, which is that marriage works for some people and not other people. That marriage is absolutely the right thing for some people, but for others, there are other sorts of relationships that work just as well. I think those processes will reciprocally influence each other and will build towards what I'm calling relationship pluralism. So what is pluralism? Pluralism simply means there's more than one truth, more than one authority, more than one right way of doing things. When we apply that to relationships, we think about it as more than one right way to meet those relationship needs that I outlined at the beginning. The needs don't change. The way in which we meet the needs does change. I mentioned that I'm not trying to knock marriage off its pedestal. I really do believe we need to build more pedestals. And I'm not exactly sure what they'll look like, but I have some thoughts. They may involve people getting married and deciding not to have children. They may involve people having committed relationships and having children without getting married. They may involve people dating but not moving on to long-term committed relationships. And they may involve people cohabitating, living together platonically while they date other people on the side. I think any of those could be good options for some people, right? Why does this matter? First and foremost, stigma is an issue here. So if you think, maybe living with friends fits better for me than living with a partner, but what society is telling you is, nah, that's what kids do. You got to grow up and move in with someone. Then you're not going to want to do it. You may know it works for you, but you're not going to really dig into it. Second, as my colleague Jay LeBeau says, you cannot choose what is not on the menu. So one of the things that pluralism does is it gives us access to a whole range of other models that work so that we have some ideas of what we can shoot for. Now, it's important to note that pluralism does not mean anything goes. There are two major checks on pluralism to make sure things are working. One is at the cultural level. So trends in relationships that don't meet our needs are going to die out. If we go back to the winter coats, if someone comes out with a winter coat for Chicago that is made of mesh, it can look really cool, but no one is going to buy it. So we can come up with all sorts of relationship trends, and people will. But if they don't meet our basic needs, if they violate our basic need for safety or emotional intimacy, we're not going to keep doing them. And the second check and balance is at the personal level. So a pluralistic system of relationships actually puts a much greater burden on each individual to figure out what works for her or him. We've got to know something about ourselves, and we've got to be honest with ourselves about what we need and what we can handle. Let me give you an example, and that is consensual non-monogamy. So increasingly, gay couples are experimenting with being monogamous in terms of emotional intimacy, so in a committed relationship, but non-monogamous in terms of sexual intimacy. Sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't. So in one example, Tim and Jeffrey, they use consensual non-monogamy because they have very different sexual needs. And so choosing non-monogamy allows them to maintain their emotional core while getting their sexual needs met elsewhere. On the other hand, Avery and Mike use non-monogamy basically as a way to play out the issues that are going on in their relationships. And non-monogamy is going to pull them apart. It's going to destroy the relationship. And so, like many couples, I work with heterosexual couples who are in middle age discovering that they really have different sexual needs. They think, well, can we adopt this consensual non-monogamy? And what I would say is, depends on whether or not you're more like couple number one or couple number two here. Because if it works for you and it allows you to maintain your other needs, it's going to work great. But if you're using it to play out a drama around lack of boundaries, no, it's going to make the relationship much, much worse. So what are things that you all can do today? What are things that you all can do to leave here and embrace pluralism in your lives and your relationships? One, you have to start with self-knowledge. And by self-knowledge, I don't mean retreating into your heads and thinking about it. The information you need is out there. You have to go, you have to relate, you have to experiment, you have to experience. You have to be open to feedback from yourself. What turns you on and what turns you off? You have to be open to feedback from other people, friends and family who know you and care about you and can help you along the way. Next, you need to think in terms of needs rather than labels. So often we get really caught up in labels like dating, committed, hooking up, and we don't think about what are the basic needs that these different relationships serve. If we can think about the needs, we don't have to worry about the complexity of the labels. Finally, you have to be honest with yourself and ask what works best for me. So if you're in your early 30s and you're thinking, you know, I'm really just happy dating around and hooking up, I don't think I want to get married, and you're doing that because you're afraid of commitment, guess what? You're not going to be happy. That's not a path that's going to work for you. You need to face the fear of commitment. You need to figure out what works for you. On the other hand, if you've looked at yourself and you know, actually, I'm good with commitment, I know I just don't want it, then it's a very different thing to take on hooking up and dating and not getting married. So, if we revisit Anna and we imagine that she's coming into therapy and she's asking, what is right for me, as opposed to what's wrong with me that marriage doesn't work, we're going to take a very different tack in therapy. We're going to experiment and we're going to explore. We're going to help her figure out what works for her. We're going to separate out cohabitation and having a kid as separate things that she might choose, totally aside from marriage, and look at what needs those things fulfill. And I would predict she'd have a lot more anxiety, or a lot less anxiety, through that process, because there's not the pressure for her to always move toward marriage. So having talked a lot about the individual burden of moving towards pluralism and the individual opportunity of moving toward pluralism, in closing, I want to shift back to the cultural level. Jose Ortega y Gasset said, I am I plus my circumstances. We are inseparable from the world that we live in and from the culture that we live in. This can be a very good thing when the culture supports us, but it can be incredibly limiting when the culture doesn't. So what I want you to think about, each and every one of you, is how in your words and actions you are supporting people in finding the relationships that work for them. How you're talking about relationships as pluralistic, more than one truth, more than one right answer, as opposed to relationships as monistic, so just one right truth, and that is marriage. And if we live that out in our words and actions, we will help people move toward a future where they will have better and more fulfilling relationships. And that's a future that I think we would all enjoy. Thanks.